Chris, welcome to the Lewis and Kyle Show. I think this is going to be a super fun time today. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, guys.
You are on a podcast tour right now, doing lots of shows because you just published a new book about building the fort. Tell us a little bit about like what was going on. What did you see? What's like the message that you just like had to get out into the world to take all the time and effort to release a book?
Well, guys, it's, you guys are both entrepreneurs and have that entrepreneurial spirit. I've been on a journey for the last 10 years about saying, after 40 years of myself being an entrepreneur, how do I help other people build companies? How do I, and, I can help one-on-one, right? I can be an investor or a mentor. I ran my own accelerator, Inspired After Techstars, did 42 investments. Those are very kind of targeted. How can I have a bigger impact? Which is, how do communities, what are the things you could do inside your geographic community to make sure that you have created the conditions for lots of people to be successful and to start their entrepreneurial journey? And the quickest way that I could kind of exemplify that, guys, is that I go around the world and I speak on, stages and do the keynote thing. And I always say, like, raise your hand if you've had an idea that you've wanted to create into a business. And you guys know, like 98% of the hands go up. And I say, leave your hand up if you've actually taken the first step towards that journey. And 98% of the hands go down. And I'm like, all right, so there's people there that have the dream to do it, but are stuck. And so what can I do to unstuck that? And that's been my mission.
Yeah, I love I saw one of the blurbs for your book was from Steve Case. And I think he has kind of some overlapping messages with his book. I actually went to an event here in Scottsdale a couple months ago and he released that book and he gave a talk about it. But I love the message, like you said, about going around the world, right? Not just like visiting San Francisco or visiting New York or other hubs. Why is that such an important, I guess, part of your mission is like startups everywhere, startups in the less common places? And what's like just like the read on that?
Well, I mean, there's this notion of like democratizing entrepreneurship, democratizing capital, right? And, back 20 plus years ago when you guys, weren't ready yet, we had to go to San Francisco or New York or Boston because that's where the community was, not just capital, but knowledge and experience. And every day that dissipates, not to the detriment of those places. Those are still very strong and noted places. But, I'm sitting here in Raleigh, Durham, North Carolina, and we have one of the fastest growing startup communities in the world. And we're doing amazing things. And, I just know that there's probably somewhere, maybe at least 500 to 1,000 new entrepreneurs in Raleigh, Durham today than there were 10 years ago. And, it can happen in places like there's enough, critical mass of knowledge, capital, assets, all the things you need to lean on to be successful. There's enough here that you don't have to go to New York. And so I kind of been, it's like, let's boost the tier 2 and tier 3 cities, right? And so I visited probably, I don't know, I can't even count anymore, 75 to 100 of them over the last 5 or 6 years, and sat with, guys like yourself and, and all the actors, economic development folks, founders, investors, university people, right? Because all these people play a role in your startup community.
So if you're a young entrepreneur and you're not in a tier 1 city, how do you meet other entrepreneurs? Like, what do you do?
Yeah, I mean, just start asking around, right? So that this tribe is very connected and very open. And I don't think you have to, you can do a couple Google searches on meetup.com or something. There's an entrepreneurial meetup somewhere. So find that, but you can also just start, asking friends, hey, do you know anybody that's doing a startup? You don't have to go more than, 2 or 3 degrees of Kevin Bacon to realize you're going to find someone. Ask to be introduced, right? These are things you guys have all done, right? In your community. And you just have to kind of be a little bit proactive. Maybe that's even the first test of whether you're really an entrepreneur. Can you put yourself out there just a little bit? So just put yourself out there and do a little bit of searching, and you'll find either a co-working space or a meetup or some kind of activity around the startup community.
Yeah, especially when you're young, people like want to invest in you. And I found that in Birmingham. I mean, I just send a bunch of cold DMs on LinkedIn, and maybe I've had some practice with the podcast, but like it's pretty quick. The one person, you kind of get ping ponged around, and then 10 entrepreneurs in Birmingham or 10 entrepreneurs in your city, and then you have a community that you're able to rely on.
What I was going to say is, in case you don't know this, whoever these listeners are, I think entrepreneurs have a very natural DNA there's like a give back, connect kind of thing. And you guys see it, right? And so it doesn't matter, whether you went to school or not, or whether you're, what gender or race you are. Like, entrepreneurs don't give a shit about any of that stuff. So, all you have to do is do a little bit of reach out, and they're going to warmly embrace you and kind of put you on your way. And like you just said, introduce you to 8 other people within the next day.
Yeah, and don't be discouraged by people who don't respond or don't say. You should obviously follow up, but if it's not working, just move on. I couldn't encourage people more to not be discouraged by people who say no, and to always there's something that Lewis introduced me to, which is not attributing malice where you can attribute ignorance or just like forgetfulness or busyness. I think that's really important to keep in mind. Yeah,
almost always busyness.
Right, especially these kind of people. But I wanted to ask about the value of startup communities, because I've seen Birmingham change really dramatically to the positive over the last 5 to 10 years. And what happened was they started investing in the idea of entrepreneurship in the city, and they planted seeds that then grew and exited their companies and have hundreds of employees now. And there's all these years and years later benefits that come from planting the seeds. But what would you say are like the you're pitching to a community developer, the mayor of a city? How do you sell them on buying into startup communities, entrepreneurship, and fostering that community?
It's a great question, Kyle. And I've dedicated the last 6 years of my life trying to figure out that answer. And the answer is it's a little different in different places, but I've actually been to Birmingham. I've actually met with the mayor. I've sat down with, your quote unquote community leaders for a couple days. And it's one of my poster childs for exactly how to do this well. And so I think, if you and I are sitting here 10, 15 years from now, we're going to look back and go, oh my God, Birmingham is killing it, right? So the first thing is, there's a couple basic things I need to share with these kind of existing leaders. First of all, this is a 20-year journey. And so you need to have both kind of the patience of letting it play out with the urgency of getting stuff done today and tomorrow. So which is kind of like an entrepreneur, right? You have this vision for where the company can go to, but you have to execute like today and tomorrow in the next 3 months. So very, very similar dynamic. If they're not already there, I have to, maybe taking a step back, I want to share with them that having a local, organic, kind of grassroots up culture of entrepreneurship diversifies your economy. Many tier 2 and tier 3 cities get very locked in to one sector. It may be the state capital. Maybe it's a state capital in a large university. Maybe it's one large manufacturer. And we all know that's very, very dangerous today. Most community leaders are having some level of brain drain. Why do they have brain drain? Because there's not opportunities. Why is there not opportunities? They don't believe they can do what they want to do in their community. So they go somewhere else. Like 20 years ago when I went to San Francisco or New York or Boston, me being the representative, old guy entrepreneur, right? So what do I tell these people? Like, listen, you got to do it. You have to do it. Everyone else is doing it, your peer city. So you better kind of have an entrepreneurship led economic development strategy. And then, now the next question, I'm going to take you a step further, Kyle. Then the question is how you do it. And what's happening, and what I loved about Birmingham was extremely collaborative, no silos, no agendas, no how do we all work together and collaborate and do what's best to create this culture of entrepreneurship in our city.
How do you participate or educate around preparing the cities to prepare the entrepreneurs to actually succeed? Right? I mean, entrepreneurship is just difficult, and in a lot of ways. And it's, again, if there was one playbook that could be worked all the time, right? It's like everyone would just be starting businesses and printing
right.
printing money.
And both in founders, we'd have everyone would be a Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg. And by the way, and every community would have 3 of those, right? So obviously there's not one playbook to run
Exactly.
or a recipe.
But what do you do in terms of like instruction or suggestion or just approach to improve the odds, right, of like actual companies emerging that are enduring and successful?
Yeah. Well, the heart of entrepreneurship and the heart of startup communities is that there's very much an overlap. I think the best companies with the best ideas and the best founders typically come out of some of the best communities, right? And it doesn't really matter which happens first in this kind of chicken or egg kind of scenario. But what you want as an entrepreneur is better access to knowledge, capital, other resources, right? Workforce, right? All these things you need to grow your company. And in that knowledge, that some of that's advice and mentorship and right introductions and all these kind of soft things. The more friction there is for you to get access to those things, the slower you are and the more risk that you don't succeed or succeed to the level that you want. Great communities reduce friction, right? To the access to these things. And in fact, so what do you need to do as a community? It's like reduce friction, figure out how to make sure people get access to knowledge, capital, and all these kind of, lots of, social capital, all these different kinds of things. The worst part is if you don't do this, if you don't work collaboratively, if you don't create connections and meaningful connections and support each other in the most positive way, the best entrepreneurs figure that out and go somewhere else. So as I say, as an entrepreneur, not only do you decide what you're going to work on, not only do you decide who you're going to work on it with, not only do you decide when you're going to launch it or go with it, you also decide where. And so it's incumbent upon communities from Birmingham to Seattle and everything in between. It's incumbent upon communities and their leadership, both leaders and influencers and all the people who kind of drive progress, to make sure that you create a great community so that your best startups stay and have access and give them some kind of unfair advantage of all the resources available in your community.
I also think that is great. Excellent. Clip that. Value bomb. No, I think that the value of failure is also very high for communities. Like entrepreneurs who go out and fail in a community, are one, probably a higher value person, an employee afterward, but they also learned what the city, the community can support. And it gives future entrepreneurs and future, leaders and business people more evidence, more information to work off of to create a success in the future. And I think that, it's very important for everyone to encourage even failure. If that is the end outcome, that is okay.
Yeah, more than okay. I mean, let's think about this. There's not a city in the world that says, hey, we have enough kind of high-tech people. Let's talk about high-tech, high-growth startups, right? The kinds that the 3 of us are most familiar with. There's not a city in the world or region in the world that says, we're good, we don't need any more, right? Every company, right? Mark Andreessen, every company is a tech company today. So if you just look around to your local corporations, they don't have enough tech talent. Well, what could be better in terms of workforce development than, which I think entrepreneurship at some level, to your point, Kyle, is a workforce development play. It's to say, listen, I want these people to go out. I want them to attempt to, give a great shot at building their companies. We know that a good number of them are going to fail after a year or two. Well, that experience as applied to building a tech company and all the things you guys are familiar with, right? Sales and marketing and leadership and hiring and firing and right, all those things that go across all of those things you go through that first couple of years. Imagine someone saying, all right, you know what? I'm not going to do another startup, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go join the local corporation. I'm going to lead a new team, right? How valuable is that person to now your local economy, right? And let's not make them go, like, let's integrate them in. So let's make sure as you're building the community that corporations support the startup community, because Everyone who fails is a new workforce development body ready to be deployed somewhere else. And maybe they'll spend you a year or two, and then maybe they'll go start another company, right? And maybe it'll be a company that helps the sector of where that business was. Like, this just is, there's a flywheel effect that happens when everyone's working together and said, this is all good stuff. We need to do more of it.
The positive flywheel of failure. That's a blog post for you right there.
I like it. I love these cliches, the positive flywheel of failure. Plus, it's hard to say.
I do want to briefly touch on kind of the opposite of high-tech entrepreneurship and its value to the world and to local communities. I mean, there's tons of people who are really good at being an electrician or flooring who go out and start their own business that supports the economy in a similar way. And they deserve to be praised and supported and encouraged just in the same way.
Yeah, the broad definition of entrepreneurship. And, you know, what's funny is that I think at least 50% of the issues with entrepreneurship are kind of mindset and mental, not actually, you know, functional or, you know, very specific, whether it's a tech business, whether you're starting a restaurant, whether you're starting a, you know, a solo practice as a BI expert, you know, whatever it is, you know, the fear that you guys led with, like, you know, the things that stop you, the things that kind of make you get stuck, all those things are applied across any business. And so, you know, having a great community has, you know, it just, those lessons and that advice and that mentorship and that support can permeate all businesses in your area. Because, by the way, you go build a high-tech business, I think the adage in economic development is for every high-tech job, there's 4.5 service jobs created.
That's awesome. I think one piece of mindset that's really critical that you addressed on the, you know, municipality level, if that's the right way to characterize it, is this is a 20-year journey, right? I think that a lot of entrepreneurs don't personally have that same level of expansiveness for themselves. 20 years is a long time, but even a lot of people like don't even think like 12 months or 24 months, like a much more manageable period of time that's still necessary. So all of the things that are kind of, you know, ambiguous in terms of the benefits of mentorship and the benefits of community, that's all extremely non-specific. And a lot of people are like, I don't see how mentorship or community is going to, like, you know, get me from where I am now to this place in the future that feels, you know, impossibly distant. But it's not, I guess that's just when you expand your time horizon to 24, 36 months, it's like, and that's kind of where Kyle, I've been from the podcast as well. It's, you know, there's no clear benefit from like every specific conversation that we have in terms of like transforming me to learn some skill set that's like a critical puzzle piece to like me becoming the entrepreneur that I want to be. But it's like, so over like the course of 6 weeks, over the course of 10 episodes, it's like, why should I do this? But over the course of 3 years, it's like participating regularly in these types of conversations and having mentorship and like these ambiguous kind of things that just kind of, again, when you don't frame it correctly, they just sound fluffy. And like what does that do for me? But when you say, okay, the impact of 3, right, you're working at a community center, you're at a weekly startup themed event, and you're doing that 50 times in a year, and you're having coffee, like you said, you had coffee like 270 times in 5 months. It's like, when you add it all up, that is like, you can't look back on that and say, over a period of 24 months of committing to a lifestyle like this, that I will not be dramatically further along in terms of the beliefs and the attitudes and the actual practical skill sets as well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, what's funny is that, you know, the 2 books that I've written so far with the mindset of build the fort. So I want you guys and your audience to think about when you're 10 years old. Yeah, that was my next
question, was going to be to paint the metaphor for us.
Right. Well, I'm going to start painting. So let's take us back. It's, you know, we're 10, 12 years old. We're in Birmingham or Arizona or Newtown Square, Pennsylvania. And your buddy says, hey, do you want to build a fort? And so I say, you know, it's a summer morning. Hey, Lewis, do you want to build a fort? And you say,
Yes. Forts.
And
I love forts.
Other than you having to take yourself off mute, you would.
That was the entire delay. That was
right.
That was for sure. Yes.
You would answer yes in a nanosecond, right? So the first of all, like, let's think about the adult version of that. Hey, Lewis, you want to build a fort? Well, yeah, kind of sounds like a good idea, but I got
to check my calendar.
I got to check my calendar, and I don't know anything about building forts, and, you know, I mean, where are we going to get the wood, and you know, like, will rain get in? And like, I don't even know, like, should we put it here? Like your backyard, right? Like, that's what we do as adults, right? We just immediately overcomplicate and bring all this psychological crap into it. So the idea of build the fort is, let's break down the noise. Let's simplify the complex. and let's think more like 10-year-olds. Now, one of the interesting things in building the fort, I believe it's lesson 4, which is have a short-term mindset. And this gets to your point about kind of, we do get preoccupied with the evolved dream, right? The place where, everything's working perfectly and the UPS driver shows up with boxes of money every day, right? Like when we're starting anything, we have this evolved dream. And that doesn't matter whether it's your startup, whether it's your restaurant, or whether it's your startup community, right? And so, you have the evolved dream that is what you aspire to be. But the question is, how do you get through the next day or two? As kids, right, that fort building activity better be no longer than 3 or 4 days, right? Or we're going to lose interest and move on. We also know we're not building the Taj Mahal. We don't need a bathroom or a kitchen. You're just pulling stuff together and it becomes a starting place. And then you go, well, what if we modified this? And what if we modified that? So the long-winded answer, with the metaphor of build a fort, or maybe I should say the long-winded, addition to what you're saying in terms of short-term and long-term is, I coined a phrase for startup community building, and I think it applies to entrepreneurs as well. Success is through 1,000 nudges. So it riffs on the death by 1,000 cuts. Success through 1,000 nudges. You keep putting more and more nudges together, and more of those nudges to be positive, incremental, moving things. And the next thing you turn around, and you have 160 episodes, and you've met 160 people, and you're connected to their networks, right? And that may seem daunting when you're starting out, but just put them up, knock them down, put them up, knock them down, and do these things over and over and over again. And before you know it, you look back 3 years later and you're like, damn, we've made a lot of progress in our company, in our community, or whatever.
I love that. I think I appreciate the metaphor enough where I feel confident I'm going to use it. I was on that phone call the other day. Kyle, were you on this phone call? Yeah, you were on the phone call with Jake from SwapStack, and he was a former podcast guest that I had reconnected with to discuss some business ideas. And I was telling him about the vision for the quarter, and he's like, "Oh, so you're saying that you're just focused on cleaning up operational debt?" I'm like, "Oh, yes, that's exactly a new word for me to use. That's exactly how to describe what I was trying to describe. Thank you. Royalty check is coming in a big box from FedEx tomorrow.
Yeah,
a box of money for you." So I feel like I just hit that same level of this making sense, where I'm about to be building forts with my words and conversations. It's coming soon. There's going to be an inevitable use case. I'm putting an 8-day timer, but I feel like I'm going to find a reason to use that metaphor in the next 8 days, because it comes back to, there's a meme format. I don't know how familiar you are with meme formats of like the left brain versus the right brain, or not left brain versus right brain, but left bell curve versus right bell curve. Exactly. And so that's genuinely been one of my big intentions for the year, is to be left bell curve, not to be right bell curve. Because it's like, let's do something. It's like, okay, and the infinite list of unhelpful questions that don't make your life any better. No. So I joined a mastermind community where they teach you how to get more clients for your business using cold email. And one of the things that they recommend is buying subdomains, or aliases of your domain. So if you send too many emails and you go to spam, you don't actually harm the reputation of your primary company's domain. And so it's well, I was thinking I could do, try orbitmetrics.com or get orbitmetrics.com, but maybe hello orbitmetrics.com. And they're like, shut up, buy 10. This is the stupidest possible line of questioning for you. And that made me fall in love with this community, because it's exactly what I needed to hear. It was stop being those are the most useless questions you could be asking. Just find the nearest word. It could be abcdefg.com. Just go and send more emails.
Lewis, keep the mic close to your face.
Okay.
That was a subtle.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's all good. We're all friends. Hey, you know what? It's all a big experiment. We're all just iterating on everything, including
exactly
mic
right.
placement.
Exactly.
Lighting has never been better.
The lighting is outstanding.
So,
but Lewis, it's just, and there's probably a handful of people out in the world that could tee it up, hit the ball out of the park. There's 6 months on a rocket ship. Maybe there's some people that exist that do that. The rest of us have to grind away and have to get these little wins and just keep pushing it forward. And invariably you get stuck, or you kind of decline, and you got to work through those issues. It's like this continual game of whack-a-mole, right? There's always another issue. And I think sometimes people feel like it's always, up and to the right kind of existence, and it's not. And in fact, I think when you talk about resilience and all of these kind of skill sets that you need to be successful, it's because, there's always a curveball coming your way, using all the sports metaphors today. But I like the fact that someone called you out and said, stop overanalyzing or overthinking which domains, buy 10, try them all, and see what happens. Like, it really doesn't frickin' matter probably in the end.
Yeah, I think the downside analysis is like very important. Like, the downside of getting your domain name, your subdomain name for your cold emails wrong is like literally zero. And so if you save time by just moving through decisions where the downside is zero, when the downside is high, you'll have much more time and much more brain capacity to actually consider the decision and whether or not it's something make a good decision. Like, what do we want to put the roof on this fort as? Because if it rains, we're done for. But where do we steal the wood from? That needs to be a quick decision.
Yeah, and let's just go out and start stealing, right? Or borrowing.
Statute of limitations, right?
Exactly. Yeah, my favorite part of that story was, where are we going to buy some wood or find some wood? And I said, well, that house they're building up there, it's funny, by the time 5 o'clock rolls around, there's all this extra wood just laying there.
That's so funny. I think that one thing that you are saying with Build the Fort, even the title in the book, is like this life of play sort of mentality that, it brings me back to this time where there's this kind of renowned or fearful teacher at my high school called Mr. C. And I never had Mr. C, but both of my siblings did. And I had one class, 1 hour with Mr. C. And from that hour, I think I learned more than all the other classes combined or something like that. But he put a dot on the whiteboard or on the chalkboard. And he asked, what is this, to like our group of 9th graders or 10th graders or something like this. And everyone was like, that's a period. Like, it's a period. Like, what are you talking about? And he's like, no, it's the eye of a cave. It's the opening to a portal, a different dimension. And like, that has stuck with me so heavily. And it's the difference between, adults who come up with a list of 1,000 reasons not to do something versus the kids who go out and start stealing the wood. And I think that having a life of play allows you to have this like mindset of creativity. And that's kind of like the setup for my question is like, how do you have a life of play, and like, how does that impact your mindset of creativity, and why is that important?
Well, I definitely think it's a muscle, and it's a muscle in a way that it can get stronger the more it's used. So, you start by doing side hustles. You start by maybe helping work on someone else's startup, right? You start by kind of, put yourself in environments where you don't just see a period, right? That you see other things. And, I think this entrepreneurial tribe, for the most part, is pretty creative, right? There's lots of different perspectives. And so I think if you can put yourself in those situations and be opening to what you hear, I think that muscle can start to build. And it may take months or maybe even a year or two. Frankly, I don't think I really became a good entrepreneur till I was in my 40s, till I kind of think I saw more of the picture and was more open and was in control of my fear and my inhibitions. So I definitely think it's something that you can build, but you have to put yourself in the place of that and where you just don't see a period. I love the story. I might be stealing that or borrowing it.
Amazing. It's a fair exchange.
Yeah.
Something interesting you've just said. This is a cringy podcast, fourth wall thing. Podcasters, I want to double tap on that. And I feel like it's funny when they don't acknowledge that it's cringy to say that. But to double tap on that, what characterized in your mind a shift between yourself as not a good entrepreneur and yourself as a good entrepreneur? I wasn't a good entrepreneur until my 40s. What was the difference between you as the effective entrepreneur and you as the ineffective entrepreneur?
Fear, just trepidation. And, I think up kind of prior to I finally releasing that, was that I would overanalyze things. I kind of I wanted to control the outcome. I think control is a weird, I think as a word, it's a weird phenomena. It's some of us feel like we have to control all aspects of our life in order to be happy or to be safe, whatever the drivers are. And it was kind of relinquishing that, control thing and just being a little bit more open to kind of just, I always think like my mental image, my visual is water running down a hill, right? It's going to find its kind of easiest path down. It's going to hit a rock and take a right. And so I think I let go a little bit more and let me just kind of find a path without worrying about what others thought of me. Family, parents, peers, right? Because entrepreneurship is still a kind of a crazy thought in most traditional worlds, right? And so once I kind of could just release that and just kind of take it off my shoulders and just say, let's see what happens. I will be successful regardless of where the water takes me.
That's a big realization. Is that guided by traumatic events? Were you working like with a therapist or with a coach? Like that's a big shift.
It was a huge shift. And I think today it would be guided by our therapist or coach. Then it was just an epiphany. It literally just hit me over the head like you would with a 2x4. And a 2x4 that we probably borrowed from up the street. But so it literally like I woke up one day, and this has happened 4 or 5 times in my life, guys, where you just kind of wake up and all of a sudden you kind of go, I'm going to look at that thing differently. It's now a cave, right? And so I don't know what inspired it. I've tried to think about it. I know exactly where I was when it happened, but I don't know why it came to be. I just know that at that point I felt like I had taken 30 pounds off my shoulders. By the way, your second startup is a lot harder than your first. If your first was successful, there's a little more pressure on you.
Well, thinking about the setup for this. A couple of weeks ago, I was going to Aiken, South Carolina. This was actually like a year ago, with my girlfriend's family, and her grandparents were following behind us, and they were following like street signs to get to Aiken, and they were like, "Do we turn in Augusta? Like this sign says Route 66." And my girlfriend was like, "Why don't you just use your map on your phone?" And there's a big generational gap between those two things, and you were a big part of making mapping technology and directions a thing. So can you talk a little bit about what that experience was like, and what it was like, or how it affected you so early in your career?
Well, let me give you a couple of things you didn't know. You probably didn't know that I have an undergraduate and a graduate degree in geography. So I'm probably the only geographer you've ever met. I'm obviously not 20 something. I'm 63 years old. So if we go back almost 40 plus years into finishing college in the early 80s, I took, I think, at least 12 to 15 hours of computer science, which was unheard of at the time. So somehow, though I'm this kind of soft liberal arts geography guy, I liked computers. And so that's really the genesis of the next 15 years of my career, is figuring out how to apply technology to mapping and cartography. So obviously MapQuest, as one of the founders, happened years later. But MapQuest was really just the evolution of a set of applied technologies, first on the desktop, then on a CD-ROM, then on, attempts with an Apple product that you probably never heard of called the Newton, which was its first handheld that didn't make it, and eventually the internet. And so the other thing I'll tell you is that we birthed all of that in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So if you know anything about Lancaster, not unlike Aiken in a weird way,
Amish country.
It's 55,000 Amish people. So obviously an unbelievable startup community, I say with all sarcasm, right? The good news is we were experts in mapping. We had an existing mapping company that, that was doing millions a year and map services. But so we knew mapping really well. And then we were kind of learning about the applied technology. So we had no fear. So what's funny is years later, fear starts to, I know what the journey, I didn't know what I didn't know back then, but obviously years later I knew, and then this kind of, inhibition and fears kind of come in. Bringing this all back to kind of, build a fort, I think about, and that's what really your question and what, how does the MapQuest journey apply in this build a fort? I think we just were a bunch of 10-year-olds who just were really motivated and took a really simple incremental approach and we ended up finding, striking gold with MapQuest. Taking that into startup communities, how do I apply that across not just one startup that I'm working on, but maybe, 50 or 100 in community? All right, let's shed all the crap. Let's try to demystify this fear thing. Let's try to figure out how the 98% keep some of their hands up, right? How do we get more people? And if I can kind of take the lessons that I learned at MapQuest and the lessons in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and then Chicago, Illinois, and Washington, D.C., and now in Raleigh, Durham, not New York or Boston. How do we kind of take all this and maybe just take enough crap off of our shoulders and our minds to be able to execute the thing that we dream about doing?
I was trying to find the mute button again.
Is it time to sing Kumbaya? Was it a little squishy?
I don't think so. I don't think too squishy. I have a very high threshold for squishy. Like extremely high threshold.
I'm the squishy meister.
Exactly. Like I go to a yoga class and the instructors say things and I'm like, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And so I'm all the way there in terms of and I'm actually it's not a good yoga class if the woo woo isn't 9 or 10 out of 10.
We could all use a little more woo woo in our life.
Yeah. I've really embraced the woo. I'm like, maybe they're just right. And that's just exactly the truth right now. You were giving a little list of cities, giving us a little tour through their career. This is sort of a bonus themed question. What are some other shout outs kind of under the radar, maybe a little bit about the research triangle? We've kind of given Birmingham some good airtime. Where else in the US, maybe not in the US, are really interesting, worth paying attention to? I'll put my hat in the ring for Scottsdale, Phoenix area. Where else?
Well, what we're doing in Durham over the last 10 to 15 years has been amazing. Raleigh and Durham are about 26 miles apart. Durham and Chapel Hill's about 8 miles apart. That's hence the triangle. Each of those places, Raleigh has NC State, very large, kind of, Arizona State, University of Alabama, kind of large, 40,000 student population. Duke University, very elite, probably 8,000 students. UNC Chapel Hill, somewhere in between 20, 25,000. So you have this kind of triangle of universities, triangle of towns, a lot of towns in between, population that's growing from 2 to 3 million over a 10-year period or so, a lot of in-migration. And yet each of those communities are a little different. And so where I've spent most of my time is in Durham. We have no racial majority in Durham, 40% white, 40% black, 20% everyone else. It's a formerly kind of industrial, textiles and tobacco. We started our startup community building initially in Durham. Today, it's got probably close to 100,000 square feet of just startup space, over 3 buildings, some of those in old tobacco warehouses. So it's a very kind of, what do we love as entrepreneurs? Cheap, shitty space, right? So when we started this 12, 15 years ago, probably 25% of the buildings in Durham were abandoned or, burn out. And so the startup community has been part of this revolution. It's now one of the New York Times' best food cities coming. Like you talked about Main Street businesses, Kyle, like all the stuff works together, right? And so I'm very proud of that. What I love is the accessibility of both Durham and the region in terms of when anybody comes new in the town, one of the first things they say after a few months is, I'm amazed how easy it is to connect to people and that everyone will take your first meeting. And so when I go all over the country, I'm kind of like, wow, my place is still pretty good there. So that's a place I love. I love Boulder, right? Home of Techstars, home of Brad Feld. And, he's such a thought leader. in terms of entrepreneurship and startup communities. But Boulder has a really great culture, right? Like, if I'm 20 something and I'm deciding where I'm going to start my company and I'm free to do it anywhere, I'm probably heading to Boulder, even more so than Denver. Um, you know, I happen to like to be a bigger fish in a smaller pond. I like easier access to things. I like less friction. So I'm not a New York, San Francisco, LA kind of person. I like these other communities that are kind of, getting to be kind of frothy. Internationally, what would I talk about? I've spent a bunch of time in Taipei, Taiwan. It's a little bit more kind of hardware focused, but it's got a very vibrant, like fast moving, and the government's playing a really good role in being more of a supporter in a big way, as opposed to trying to be the leader, because it never usually works that way when the government takes the lead position. Boy, there's a couple. There's one more in there. I have a very good buddy in Reykjavik, Iceland. And for this little weird island, they have a frothy little startup community, especially post 2007, 2008, when the government said, we're going to try to be a place for Europeans to come and get stuff done. And so when I think about a leading community, it doesn't necessarily have to be just big. I just want it to be kind of optimal, right? So even places like Knoxville or Nashville or Birmingham, maybe not Aiken, might be still a little small, but all these places, obviously Phoenix, Denver. I mean, I've talked to people in all of them, Boise, Idaho.
One bonus question from me, one from you, and then I think this will be right on time for everybody. What is the importance of your writing practice? Looked at your blog and it was like scrolling down, hitting next page, next. I mean, there are 56 pages to scroll through, and not 56 blog posts, 56 pages. That's a lot of writing. What's the importance of that? Why do you do it?
Thanks for asking a question. By the way, I have to say that you're talking to a guy who failed freshman English in college because he couldn't write. I was told all through high school and college. I didn't learn until grad school kind of how to write. And it's actually pretty simple, but somehow I got lost in that. For me, writing is therapy. Writing is, and I owe a lot of my blog writing to, I'm blanking on his name, but a gentleman who's the managing editor of Inc. magazine. And he asked me if I would be interested in being a contributing writer, which I thought was very exciting. And this was, probably 6-7 years ago. And I said, well, what do you want me to write about? He goes, just write what you see. And so that's my kind of motivation. Write what I see and just share that with people. The other thing is, not unlike kind of you guys starting on your episode, I'm not assuming that like 100,000 people are going to read that blog post, nor I'm striving to do that. All I know is that when you put a body of work out there and the long tail, right, of work and the long tail of access, is that cumulatively, I might be seeing 5,000 or 10,000 people a week see my stuff. It may be over 500 pieces, because in that moment, that day, that post meant something to someone that they would wanted to go in and dive in. So from a blog post writing point of view, it's a little bit of therapy. It's a little bit sharing. It's obviously, like you guys, it's a little bit of a brand play and a little bit of like getting myself out there, which hopefully creates new opportunities for things. The book writing is kind of like a love thing. My dad was a huge avid reader. I mean, 5 to 8 books a week for as long as the later part of his life, 40 years. So I think I'm writing, even though he's no longer with us, I think I'm writing the books for him in some weird kind of, meta way.
Now is me looking for the mute button. 5 to 8 books is a lot. I love that. It reminds me of Warren Buffett writing his annual letter to his sister. And I think that when you look at it through that lens, you probably say things or things come to mind that otherwise wouldn't. But I did remember my earlier question. I often hear people a lot younger than you say, not a lot younger, I mean like that, but like they say that when they were young, being an entrepreneur wasn't cool. It was like weird. It was this like, what the hell are you doing kind of thing. Whereas today it's definitely in vogue. Is that true? Like, you don't want to believe everything you hear on the internet. When you were young, was it weird to be an entrepreneur? And what do you think it is that has changed over time?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Kyle, because I didn't even know what an entrepreneur was. I didn't even know the word for many, many years of my, kind of college to, first X years of post-college. My first job out of college was at the U.S. State Department, basically. So government position. The next thing you know, I get recruited to this mapping company in Lancaster that's one part of a $6 billion printing company. So in today's parlance, some people may call those initiatives maybe more of an intrapreneur. So I think I was showing entrepreneurial thinking and kind of problem solving and disrupting and trying to make things better, right? That's what entrepreneurs typically do. But I was doing them inside large beasts of government or corporation. So yes, it's true. I think it's definitely more sexy and more attainable or knowledgeable, or there's a greater awareness of being an entrepreneur today. And I think the media has a lot to do with it, right? The media kind of talking about Jeff Bezos or Richard Branson or Steve Jobs, right? Mark Zuckerberg, right? The media has really created a very unhealthy but sexy kind of portrayal of that journey and what could be. And so when you're 18 and 20, when you see that, you're like, I want to do that. I want to sign up for the Zuckerberg plan. The other thing I would say that I think is a little bit more psychological and interesting is I think we've taught you all, I'm the age, not a little older than probably your parents. We've taught you to be self-servant, to be, to do your own thing, to follow your, right? I think we've been trying to do that for years. Like you can do whatever you want, and so in that, I think the idea of starting or joining or being part of a early stage startup kind of endeavor, taking an idea to launch, I think that it's something that we've been baking into you for years and years. Versus me when I was in that stage, all my dad wanted me to do is get a good job that would last me a lifetime.
Well, this has been an awesome podcast conversation. Thank you so much, Chris, for coming on with us. You have a website, you have a book, you have other things. What do you want to direct attention to from people who have been with us the whole time and still want to keep going?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're motivated, go find one of the 2 books on Amazon.com. Just search for Build a Fort and my name, Chris Heivly. The other thing is I do open office hours every week. You can go to my website at heivly.com and just find me through contact. I think it's contact me, contact us, whatever. And I'll do 20 minutes. Anybody can sign up. We can talk about whatever you want to talk about. Typically booked a couple weeks in advance. Most of those people are entrepreneurs. I did an hour this morning. Usually they're Thursday mornings for me. They're my favorite part of the week is I get to talk to, guys just like you and talk about whatever you want to talk about. And I always tell them at the end, hey, my advice is no better or worse than anybody else's. I'm going to sleep the same whether you use it or not. But here's one other data point that you can consider.
That's an awesome offer. That's one of the cooler call to actions I think we've had on the podcast. But that's like cooler than being like, yeah, DM me on Twitter, follow me. I don't know. I like that. So
yeah,
awesome.
Let's just chat.
Yeah. Well, we will wrap this up here. And amazing.